The words cut through the ballroom like a blade through silk, sharp and deliberate, designed to wound. Look who finally decided to crawl out of whatever hole he's been hiding in. Every conversation ceased. More than 200 former classmates turned toward the source of the voice, a tall, broad-shouldered alpha with a cruel smirk and an arm wrapped possessively around a stunning young man who looked like he'd stepped off a magazine cover. His pheromones rolled off him in waves of smug satisfaction, cedar, and something metallic, like the scent of a newly minted success. He was every inch the alpha who had made it, who had proven himself, who had risen above the mediocrity of their shared past. Julian Cross slowly lowered his champagne glass from the refreshment table. He'd been perfectly content to stand here, invisible, watching the sea of familiar faces he hadn't seen in 12 years. 12 years since the divorce. 12 years since Derek Holloway had looked him in the eyes and told him he was too ambitious, too focused, not enough of an omega, to be worthy of a rising alpha's career. 12 years since he'd packed his bags and walked out of their shared apartment with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. 12 years of silence. 12 years of rebuilding. 12 years of becoming someone Derek Holloway would never recognize. 12 years of proving to himself that he was more than the sum of his failures. "Hello, Derek," Julian said quietly, turning to face the man who had once promised him forever. His voice was steady, calm, betraying none of the storm that raged beneath his skin. He'd learned to control his pheromones, to project calm when he felt anything but. It was a skill he'd developed in the long months after the divorce, when he'd had to pretend he was fine so the world wouldn't see how broken he really was. Derek Holloway looked him up and down with theatrical disdain, making absolutely no effort to hide his disappointment. The years had been kind to Derek. He'd filled out, gained confidence, become exactly the kind of alpha the world expected him to be. His suit was Italian. His shoes were handmade. His watch probably cost more than most people made in a year. He was every inch the successful alpha, and he wanted everyone in this room to know it. His eyes swept over Julian with the same contempt they'd always held, the same dismissal that had made Julian feel so small for so many years. "I thought you'd be doing better than this," Derek announced loudly enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "I mean, look at you. Still wearing off-the-rack suits? Still hiding in corners? Still using that cheap Omega cologne that smells like desperation and failure?" He shook his head slowly, the picture of disappointment. "I thought life would have upgraded you a little, Jules. I really did. I thought you might have figured things out by now. I thought you might have found some success, some purpose." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Julian's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he set down his glass, but his face remained a mask of serene composure. He'd learned that mask in the 12 years since Derek had torn his heart out and thrown it away like garbage. He'd learned to smile when he wanted to scream, to nod when he wanted to argue, to walk away when he wanted to stay and fight. He'd learned that showing weakness only gave people like Derek more ammunition. The young man on Derek's arm tilted his head, his perfectly styled hair catching the light like spun gold. He was beautiful in that aggressive, polished way that screamed money and privilege. His pheromones were delicate and floral, the kind that Omegas use to signal their availability to powerful alphas. He'd clearly chosen his target well, had clearly done his research on who held the most power in this room. His eyes swept over Julian with the same disdain Derek had shown, appraising him and finding him wanting. "So this is the famous ex-husband," he purred, his voice dripping with honey and poison. "I've heard so much about you, Julian. Derek told me you were a writer or something. That's adorable. My Omega instincts just scream, works from home in pajamas." He laughed, a tinkling sound that was clearly rehearsed. "I expected someone a little more. I don't know, impressive. Someone who looked like they'd actually accomplished something. Someone who looked like they could compete." Derek laughed, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet ballroom. "The one and only. Julian, this is Kyle. My fiancé. I know I upgraded." He winked at the crowd, and several people chuckled along, too afraid of Derek's power to do anything else. He's everything you never were, Jules. Ambitious, supportive, willing to stand by his man, willing to be what I need. Kyle smiled sweetly before delivering the killing blow. Oh, I expected someone a little more impressive. Derek made you sound like such a catch. But you're just so ordinary. It's almost disappointing. I was expecting some kind of drama, some kind of scandal. Instead I get a man who can't even afford a decent suit. A man who looks like he gave up years ago. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Julian could see the pity in their eyes, the familiar discomfort of watching someone get publicly eviscerated. He'd seen that look before, 12 years ago, when Derek had announced their divorce at a company party and told everyone Julian was holding him back, too emotional. Not alpha enough to understand what real ambition looked like. He'd seen it when Derek had drained their joint account and left Julian with nothing but debt and a shattered sense of self-worth. He'd seen it when Derek had spread rumors that Julian was unstable, difficult, impossible to live with, a burden rather than a partner. He'd seen it when Derek had made sure everyone knew Julian was the problem. But Julian had survived all of that. He'd rebuilt himself from the ground up, brick by brick, day by day. He'd clawed his way out of the darkness and into the light. And tonight, standing in this ballroom full of people who'd watched him fall, he realized something profound. He didn't need any of them to believe in him anymore. He believed in himself. He'd done the impossible. He'd built an empire from the ashes of his destroyed life. He'd become someone Derek could never even imagine. It's nice to meet you too, Kyle, Julian said calmly, his voice betraying nothing. Derek speaks very highly of you. I can see why he chose you. Derek shook his head, still wearing that infuriating smirk. Still polite. That was always your problem, Jules. You never knew when to fight back. You just rolled over and showed your belly like a good little Omega. He turned toward the crowd, raising his voice for maximum effect, his alpha pheromones broadcasting dominance and triumph. You know, back in college, everyone thought he would be the successful one. Everyone said Julian Cross was destined for greatness. The Omega with the 4.0 GPA. The one who was going to change the world. The one who was going to prove that Omegas could do anything Alphas could do. The one who was going to make us all proud. Laughter spread across a nearby table. Derek continued, warming to his audience like a performer on opening night, milking every moment of his triumph. And look at us now. He spread his arms proudly, his alpha pheromones intensifying with his triumph, filling the air around them. I own one of the fastest growing development firms in the state. 7 major projects. A beautiful Omega on my arm. A penthouse overlooking the city. A reputation that opens doors wherever I go. And he pointed dramatically at Julian. What exactly do you do these days, Jules? Besides taking notes in your little journal and dreaming about things that'll never happen? Besides pretending you're still relevant? Every eye settled on Julian. He could feel the weight of their stares, the curiosity, the barely concealed schadenfreude. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that he could end this right now. One phone call, one word to his assistant, one announcement that would shatter Derek's smug confidence into a million pieces. One email to the board that would make everything clear. One conversation that would change everything. But that wasn't who he was. That had never been who he was. He'd never been the kind of person who used power as a weapon. I've been working, Julian said simply, his voice carrying no emotion. Derek laughed, the sound brittle and forced. Working where? Writing greeting cards? I heard you tried to publish a novel. How'd that work out? Did you get rejected by every publisher in the city? Did they tell you it was too ambitious for someone like you? Did they tell you to stick to something more suitable for an Omega? I help build communities, Julian said quietly. In a way. Kyle burst into laughter, the sound like breaking glass. Oh, that's adorable. Community organizer? Did you run a bake sale? Did you hand out flyers? Did you organize a neighborhood watch? Did you write letters to the editor? Derek slapped his knee, his laughter echoing through the room. I knew it. I always said he'd end up doing something pointless and noble. All talk, no action. Remember when he used to lecture me about building something meaningful? He made air quotes with his fingers. Remember when he told me I was wasting my talent on profit instead of purpose? Remember when he said I should be ashamed of myself for chasing money? Meanwhile, I'm out here building actual skyscrapers. Real things. Things that matter. Things that change the skyline. Things that make money. More laughter. Julian felt something twist in his chest, but his expression didn't change. He'd spent too many years letting Derek's words wound him. He wasn't that person anymore. He'd learned that words only have power if you let them. He'd learned that the best revenge is living well, not fighting back. He'd learned that the opinions of people like Derek didn't matter. Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, pressing it into Julian's hand with theatrical generosity. You know what? Since we're old friends, and I'm feeling charitable, I'll get you a job. We need someone to answer phones. It's not much, but it's a start. You don't have to be embarrassed, Jules. Everybody falls sometimes. The important thing is getting back up. Even if it's just answering phones for your ex-husband. Even if it's just admitting you need help. The room erupted. Kyle clapped enthusiastically. Derek, you're so generous. What a wonderful alpha you are. So kind and forgiving. So willing to help the less fortunate. Someone whispered loudly enough for others to hear. I guess the divorce really hit him hard. He looked so defeated. So broken. So lost. Like he's given up completely. Another voice followed. I heard he disappeared after everything collapsed. Couldn't handle the humiliation. Probably living in some rundown apartment somewhere, surviving on charity. Probably regretting ever leaving Derek. Julian looked down at the business card in his hand. Holloway Development Holdings. Building tomorrow, today? The paper was thick and expensive, embossed with gold lettering. He slipped it into his pocket, feeling the weight of all the years he'd spent proving Derek wrong. All the years of silent work and quiet determination. All the years of building something real. Thank you, he said softly. I appreciate your concern. I really do. For a brief second, Derek looked genuinely confused. He'd expected tears, or anger, or at least some kind of outburst. Instead, nothing but that infuriating serenity. That quiet confidence that had always made Derek uncomfortable. That unshakable calm that Derek had never been able to penetrate. That stillness that came from knowing exactly who you were. Why aren't you upset? Derek demanded, his voice rising. I'm insulting you. I'm humiliating you in front of everyone we went to school with. I'm telling everyone you're a failure. I'm making you look like a joke. Why aren't you reacting? Why aren't you fighting back? I noticed, Julian said evenly, his eyes meeting Derek's. And I don't have to accept every opinion someone has about me. Your opinion of me, Derek, stopped matching the day you walked out. The day you decided I wasn't worth fighting for. The day you decided I wasn't enough. Kyle leaned closer to Derek, his voice carrying. You know what I admire, baby? People who accept reality. It takes courage to admit when someone else has won. It takes real strength to accept your place in the world. Some people just can't do that. They keep fighting when they should just give up. They keep pretending when they should just admit defeat. Derek laughed again, louder this time. She's right. You always were too proud to admit when you needed help, Jules. Too proud to admit you'd failed. Too proud to admit I was right about you. Too proud to admit that I was the one who made the right choice by leaving. Too proud to see the truth. Julian simply nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm glad you're both happy. I truly am. I hope you have everything you deserve. I hope you get everything you've earned. Then he walked away before either of them could say another word, his steps measured and calm, his head held high. He didn't look back. He'd spent too many years looking back at what he'd lost. It was time to look forward. It was time to see what he'd gained. Outside the ballroom, Julian stood on the quiet terrace overlooking the city lights. The October air was sharp and cold, and he welcomed the sting against his skin. It grounded him, reminded him that he was real, that this moment was real, that he wasn't still the broken Omega who'd spent 6 months unable to get out of bed after Derek left him. He'd come so far from that dark place. He'd built something extraordinary. And he'd done it all alone. He'd clawed his way out of the abyss with nothing but his own determination and the memory of who he'd once dreamed of being. He'd become exactly who he was meant to be. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Then again, and again. The persistent buzzing was a reminder of the world he'd left behind for tonight. The world he'd built from nothing. The world that needed him. He glanced at the screen. Richard, Executive Office. Ignored. Another call. State Infrastructure Board. Ignored. Another. Chief of Staff. Ignored. Another. Governor's Office. Ignored. Another. Mayor's Office. Ignored. He placed the phone on silent. Tonight wasn't about work. At least it wasn't supposed to be. Tonight was supposed to be about reconnecting with old friends. About remembering who he'd been before Derek Holloway had torn his life apart. But the universe had other plans. The universe had a way of bringing the past crashing into the present. Julian. He turned. A man was hurrying toward him, and for a moment Julian's heart seized. But it wasn't Derek. It was Marcus Chun, a beta who'd been in their study group back in college. Marcus was older now, graying at the temples, but his smile was the same warm, steady thing Julian remembered from their long nights studying for engineering exams. Marcus had always been kind, always been steady, always been there in the background while Julian chased after Derek. Marcus had been the one who stayed up with him when he was stressing about exams, the one who brought him coffee when he was too exhausted to function, the one who never asked for anything in return, the one who always made him feel seen. "Oh my goodness, it's really you," Marcus said, pulling Julian into a warm embrace. "It's been forever. You look wonderful. You look happy. You look like you found yourself. You look like you've become who you were always meant to be." "So do you," Julian managed, surprised by how genuine the words felt. "It's good to see you, Marcus. It's really good. I've thought about you over the years. I've wondered how you were." Marcus stepped back, his expression turning serious. "I saw what Derek did in there. I wanted to throw my drink at him. I wanted to punch him in his smug alpha face. The nerve of that man, after everything he did to you, after the way he treated you, after all the years of—" Julian laughed softly, the sound surprising even him. "That would have made tonight memorable. People would be talking about that for years. You'd be a legend. It already is." Marcus's smile faded, replaced by something grave. "Listen, Julian. I actually needed to talk to you. Not here. Somewhere private. It's important. Life-changing important. It can't wait." They walked farther down the terrace, away from the noise and the lights. Marcus lowered his voice, his beta scent shifting with anxiety, a sharp tang of worry cutting through his usual calm. "I'm the Alumni Association treasurer now. I know it's not glamorous, but someone has to do it. Someone has to watch the money. Congratulations. That's a big responsibility. It means people trust you. It means people believe in you. I wish it felt like one." Marcus looked around to make sure no one could hear. "The scholarship fund. Money is disappearing. Millions of dollars, Julian. Millions. A number so large it makes my head spin. A number that could change thousands of lives." Julian frowned, his mind already working through the implications. How? Who's managing the accounts? Who has access? Who's been signing off? Me, technically. But the approvals come from elsewhere. Marcus reached into his briefcase and removed a thin envelope, his hands trembling slightly. "I shouldn't even have these. I shouldn't be showing them to anyone. But I don't know who else to trust. You're the only person I can trust. You're the only person who would know what to do." Inside were copies of invoices, wire transfers, approval signatures, vendor payments. Julian slowly flipped through them, his trained eye catching the patterns almost immediately. They were paying consulting firms, dozens of them, with different names and different addresses. But every single one traced back to the same post office box. Every single one had been approved by the same signatures. Every single one had followed the same suspicious pattern. Every single one was designed to hide the truth. "Who approved these?" Julian asked quietly. Marcus hesitated. "I wish I were wrong. I wish it was a mistake. I wish there was another explanation. He pointed toward one signature. Derek Holloway. Another page, Holloway Development Holdings. Another, Kyle's maiden name attached to a consulting firm called Apex Strategies. The same pattern, again and again. Millions of dollars funneled through shell companies into the pockets of Derek Holloway and his associates. Money that was supposed to help students, to change lives, to create opportunities. Money that was supposed to build futures. Julian carefully returned the papers. Does anyone else know? Only the forensic accountant. And he asked me not to confront anyone until he finished. He said it would be dangerous, that these people have power and they'll do anything to protect themselves. He said I should be careful who I told. He said I should watch my back. Julian nodded. He's right. You can't accuse someone like Derek without evidence. You need to be patient. You need to let the investigation run its course. You need to be careful. Marcus looked surprised. You're not angry? You're not furious? After everything he did to you, after the way he humiliated you tonight, after all the years of anger doesn't prove anything, Julian said calmly. Anger doesn't build cases. Anger doesn't help those students who are losing their scholarships. But if Derek's guilty, facts will expose him. If he's innocent, accusations could destroy an innocent person. And I don't want to be responsible for that. I don't want to become him. Marcus stared at him, his eyes wide with admiration. You really haven't changed. You're still the same Julian I knew in college. The one who could stay calm when everyone else was panicking. The one who always knew the right thing to do. The one who never let anyone else define him. The one who always saw the bigger picture. Julian smiled softly. I hope not. I hope I've changed for the better. I hope I've become someone worthy of the life I've built. I hope I've become someone who makes a difference. Marcus smiled sadly. I have. 20 years ago, I would have wanted revenge. I would have wanted to destroy Derek publicly, to make him feel the same pain he's caused everyone else, to humiliate him the way he humiliated you, to make him pay for everything he's done. But now, I don't know. Maybe I'm getting old. Maybe I'm getting soft. Maybe I've learned that revenge doesn't actually fix anything. Julian looked back toward the ballroom. So would I? But revenge doesn't heal anything. It just makes you the same as the people who hurt you. And I refuse to be that person. I refuse to let him change me. Inside, Derek was still holding court, his alpha pheromones filling the room with triumph. He'd gathered a crowd around him, a collection of sycophants who laughed at his jokes and nodded at his pronouncements. So, he announced, lifting his drink again. Who remembers when Julian used to tell everyone he wanted to change cities with better infrastructure? That he was going to transform the world? That he was going to build schools and hospitals and libraries? That he was going to make a real difference? Several classmates laughed. I remember. He used to talk about it all the time. I'm going to build schools, he'd say. I'm going to build libraries. I'm going to change everything. I'm going to make the world better. I remember, Derek continued, shaking his head dramatically. He had these huge dreams. All those late nights studying. All that I'm going to make a difference nonsense. And look at him now. Can't even get a real job. Can't even afford a decent suit. Can't even. Kyle smirked, his hand resting on Derek's arm. Dreams are free. Anyone can have dreams. Not everyone can make them reality. It takes real work to make dreams come true. It takes real ambition. They sure are. Derek grinned. Reality is expensive. Requires hard work. Requires sacrifice. Requires the kind of ambition most Omegas just don't have. The kind of ambition that separates the winners from the dreamers. The kind of ambition that makes empires. More laughter. Julian continued speaking with Marcus as though he hadn't heard a word, his face impassive, his pheromones completely controlled. You really don't want to respond? Marcus whispered, his eyes flickering with barely suppressed anger. You really don't want to go back in there and show him who you really are? You really don't want to make him eat his words? Julian smiled. What would I gain? What would responding accomplish? Derek has already shown everyone in that room exactly who he is. And I don't need to defend myself against people who've already made up their minds. I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I already know who I am. Marcus studied his friend's face. I don't know how you stay this calm. I really don't. If it were me, I'd be furious. I'd be screaming. I wasn't always this calm. What changed? Julian looked toward the windows, his reflection ghostly in the glass. I finally stopped measuring my life by someone else's opinion. It took years. It took therapy and tears, and a lot of dark nights alone. But eventually I realized that Derek never actually saw me. He saw what he wanted to see, and I spent too long trying to be that. I spent too long trying to be enough for someone who would never be satisfied. I spent too long trying to earn the love of someone who didn't deserve it. I spent too long trying to be something I wasn't. Before Marcus could answer, another familiar voice interrupted. Julian. Both men turned. A silver-haired alpha stood there, her eyes bright with tears. Professor Linda Hayes, Julian's former engineering advisor. The woman who'd encouraged him when everyone else told him an Omega should pursue something more suitable. The woman who'd written him letters of recommendation for graduate programs that had rejected him because of his designation. The woman who'd never stopped believing in him, even when he'd stopped believing in himself. The woman who'd seen his potential when no one else could. Julian's smile grew instantly, and for the first time all night, it reached his eyes. Professor Hayes. Without hesitation, Julian hugged his former mentor. The older alpha smelled like old books and cinnamon, the same comforting scent Julian remembered from a decade ago. She'd been the first person to tell him that his dreams weren't foolish, that his ambition wasn't unwelcome, that being an Omega didn't mean he had to settle for less. She'd been the first person to make him believe he could be more. She'd been the first person to see who he really was. You look wonderful, Professor Hayes said, stepping back to look at him. You look, I can't explain it. You look like you've finally found yourself. Like you've finally become who you were always meant to be. Like you've finally stepped into your power. So do you. You look exactly the same as you did when I was 19 and terrified of failing. When I thought my dreams were impossible. When I didn't think I could do it. Derek watched from across the room, his eyes narrowing. Look at that, he muttered to Kyle. Kyle glanced over. Who's the old alpha? She looks familiar. Like I've seen her somewhere before. Like I recognize her from somewhere. One of Julian's professors. She always had a soft spot for him. Always thought he was special, that he was going to do great things. She was wrong, obviously, but she never saw it. She never saw how ordinary he really was. She never saw the truth. Professor Hayes held Julian's hands, her eyes searching his face with the intensity of someone who truly cared. You know, I still tell students about you. You were one of the brightest young minds I ever taught. I've had so many students over the years, and none of them had your combination of intelligence, creativity, and drive. None of them. You were special, Julian. You always were. You always will be. Derek couldn't resist. He walked over, his alpha pheromones broadcasting confidence like a physical presence, pushing into their space. Professor Hayes, it's been a long time. You look well. You look like you're doing well. She turned politely. Oh, Derek. Yes, it has been a long time. I've seen your name in the papers. I've seen what you've built. He smiled smugly. I was just telling everyone how successful life has been. Real estate has treated me very well. I've built an empire from nothing. I'm sure you've seen my buildings around the city. They're impossible to miss. They're everywhere. I heard, Professor Hayes said, her voice carefully neutral. Derek nodded proudly. I was also offering Julian a position. If he's looking for work. I know how hard it can be for Omegas to find meaningful employment, and I thought I could help him out. After all, we were married once. I owe him that much. I owe him a chance. Professor Hayes frowned slightly. A position? What kind of position? Reception. Administration. Something suitable for someone with his interests. He can file papers, answer phones, make coffee. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. Good enough for someone like him. Good enough for someone who's fallen so far. Kyle added, we're very generous. We're always looking for ways to help the less fortunate. It's important to give back. It's important to help those who can't help themselves. Professor Hayes looked at Julian. You need a job? I thought you were. Julian answered before she could finish. I'm doing just fine. I don't need any assistance, Professor. I promise. I'm exactly where I want to be. Derek laughed. He's too humble to admit he could use a little help. He's always been that way. Too proud to accept charity, even when he desperately needs it. Even when he's drowning. Even when he's lost everything. Professor Hayes looked from Derek to Julian, and something flickered in her eyes. A knowing smile touched her lips. I've learned not to underestimate quiet people, Derek. I've learned that the ones who don't brag are often the ones who've accomplished the most. The ones who don't need validation from others are the ones who've truly succeeded. The ones who are most secure in themselves. Derek chuckled dismissively. I don't underestimate anyone. I just know Julian better than anyone. I was married to him for 5 years. I know what he's capable of, and it's not much. I know his limits. I know his weaknesses. He excused himself before anyone could continue the conversation. As he walked away, Kyle whispered, Why was she looking at you like that? Like she knew something we didn't? Like she was laughing at us? Like she had a secret? Derek shrugged. Old professors always have favorites. She always thought Julian was special. She was wrong, but she never admitted it. She never could see the truth. She never could see how ordinary he really was. Professor Hayes waited until they were out of earshot. I almost corrected him. I almost told him everything. I almost told him the truth. Julian shook his head. Please don't. It doesn't matter. It wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make him a better person. Why? Why wouldn't you want him to know? Why wouldn't you want everyone in this room to know the truth? Why would you let him believe you're still? Because tonight isn't about proving anything. Tonight isn't about showing off. I didn't come here to one-up anyone. I came here to reconnect with old friends and remember who I used to be. I came here to honor the person I was before everything fell apart. I came here to remember my roots. The professor smiled warmly. You're still exactly who I hoped you'd become, Julian. Maybe even more. You've become someone I'm proud of. You've become someone who makes a difference. A waiter approached Julian. Sir? Someone asked me to give you this. He handed Julian a small folded note. Julian opened it. Everything is ready. Whenever you are. No name. No signature. Just those words, written in an elegant hand. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Marcus noticed. What was that? Is everything okay? Who is it from? Is something happening? Nothing urgent. Just a reminder. Someone who's waiting for me. Someone who believes in me. You don't seem surprised. Julian smiled. I'm not. Across the ballroom, Derek was now surrounded by former classmates asking about his latest developments. His alpha pheromones were so strong they were almost suffocating, a testament to his ego. So how many projects do you have now? One man asked, his eyes wide with admiration. Derek grinned. 6 major ones. The 7th will change everything. It's going to transform this city. It's going to make me a legend. It's going to make me immortal. Kyle wrapped his arm around him. The city redevelopment project. The one everyone's been talking about. The one that's going to change everything. The one that's going to make us rich. Derek nodded proudly. Exactly. It's going to be the biggest project this city has ever seen. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Thousands of jobs. I'm going to make this city into something magnificent. Something everyone will remember. Something that will last forever. Someone whistled. That contract is worth hundreds of millions. I read about it in the paper. They said it was going to be awarded to the best firm in the state. They said it would be the biggest deal in decades. They said it would change everything. Derek lifted his chin. We've basically got it. It's only a matter of time. The bidding process is just a formality at this point. I've already got the mayor's ear. I've already got the support. I've already got the votes. Applause broke out around him. Derek soaked in every second, his ego inflating visibly. He noticed Julian walking past, heading toward the refreshment table, and his eyes lit up with cruel amusement. Hey, he called out. Julian stopped, his back straightening slightly. Yes. You should come see the site sometime, Derek said loudly. See what real success looks like. See what happens when you actually achieve your dreams instead of just talking about them. See what happens when you have real ambition. See what happens when you're not afraid to work. Julian smiled politely. I've seen enough construction sites for one lifetime. I've seen enough of what you're building. I've seen enough. Derek smirked. I doubt that. I doubt you've seen anything like what I'm building. I doubt you've seen real success at all. I doubt you know what success looks like. Julian simply nodded and walked away, his composure unbroken. One classmate frowned, watching him go. Doesn't he seem different? More, I don't know, confident? More sure of himself? Like he's hiding something? Like he knows something we don't? What do you mean? Derek demanded, his good mood souring. I don't know. He doesn't look defeated. He doesn't look broken. He looks like someone who's actually doing okay. Like someone who's found his feet. Like someone who's succeeded. Derek scoffed loudly. Trust me. I was married to him. I know exactly who he is. He's always been too proud to show weakness. He'd rather pretend he's fine than admit he needs help. It's one of the things I hated most about him. It's one of the reasons I left. He could never be honest. At another table, Marcus leaned closer to Julian, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been reviewing those invoices for weeks. They're too clean. Everything about them is wrong. They're perfect in a way that makes my skin crawl. They're designed to hide something. What do you mean? Julian asked, his eyes scanning the crowd. Every payment follows procedure. Every approval is properly documented. Every vendor appears legitimate. That's intentional. When people hide fraud, they usually make mistakes. They get sloppy. They leave traces. But experienced people create paperwork that looks absolutely perfect. Too perfect. It's been constructed carefully. Julian nodded slowly. I've seen complicated contracts before. I've seen people who are very good at hiding their tracks. I've seen the best and the worst of this industry. I know how these things work. You think Derek knew? You think he was involved in all of this from the beginning? Or do you think he was just used? Do you think he was a victim too? I don't know. And Kyle? I don't know either. I don't know anything, and I'm not going to jump to conclusions. That's how innocent people get hurt. That's how mistakes get made. Marcus sighed heavily. I hate not knowing. I hate not being able to do anything about it. I hate feeling powerless. I hate watching this happen. So do investigators. But that's why they investigate. That's why they do their work carefully. Because if you rush, if you make accusations before you have proof, you can destroy innocent people. You can ruin lives. You can make everything worse. Before either man could continue, a loud clinking sound echoed through the ballroom. The reunion host tapped a spoon against his glass, calling for attention. May I have everyone's attention, please? Conversations slowly faded. Guests turned toward the stage, where the host stood with a microphone. We'll begin tonight's recognition ceremony in just a few minutes. We have some very special guests joining us, and we want to make sure everyone is seated and ready. This is a very special evening. Guests applauded. Derek leaned toward Kyle. This should be fun. I heard they're going to recognize outstanding alumni. I heard there are awards. I heard there are honors. Kyle smiled. I hope they recognize your company. You've done so much for this community. You've built so much. You've given so much. They might. I've been nominated for several awards. I've been told I'm a shoo-in. I've been told I'm the favorite. The host continued. But first, we'd like everyone to take their seats. We'll be starting shortly. Please find your seats. Please settle in. Rows of round tables filled quickly. Julian quietly chose a seat near the back, away from the spotlight. He'd never liked being the center of attention, had always preferred to observe rather than be observed. He'd always been more comfortable in the shadows. Derek noticed and laughed. Still hiding. Still in the back. Still afraid to be seen. Still afraid to be noticed. Still afraid of the spotlight. Kyle whispered, people sit in the back when they don't want attention. When they know they haven't accomplished anything worth recognizing. When they know they don't belong in the front. When they know they've failed. Derek nodded. Exactly. He knows he doesn't belong in the front. He knows he hasn't done anything worth celebrating. He knows he's nothing. He knows his place. Professor Hayes deliberately walked across the ballroom and sat beside Julian, her presence a quiet statement of solidarity. Several classmates noticed. So the professor picked Julian. Interesting. She must still believe in him. She must still think he's special. She must still have faith in him. Derek rolled his eyes. Sentimental. She's always had a soft spot for him. She never could see how ordinary he really is. She never could see the truth. She never could see what everyone else saw. The lights dimmed slightly. The reunion host returned to the microphone, his expression unusually serious. Before we celebrate the achievements of our graduating class, he paused dramatically. We have one special guest joining us this evening. Someone who has requested anonymity until this moment. Someone who's been waiting for the right time. Derek whispered to Kyle. Probably the mayor. Or maybe a celebrity. Someone important. Someone with real power. Someone who matters. Kyle smiled. Or a billionaire. Someone with real money. Someone who can make a difference. Someone who can change things. The ballroom doors opened. Several distinguished men and women in business attire entered quietly, their movements purposeful. They didn't stop to greet anyone. Instead, they looked around the room until one of them smiled. There he is, he whispered. They began walking directly toward Julian. Derek watched with a puzzled expression. Do you know those people? They look familiar. They look important. They look powerful. Kyle shook his head. No, I've never seen them before. They're not from our world. They're not from our circle. Neither of them noticed every member of the group smiling respectfully as they approached the Omega they'd mocked all evening. The man leading the group stopped in front of Julian and smiled warmly. My apologies for interrupting your evening. I know you wanted this time to yourself. I know you wanted to be anonymous. I know you wanted to be invisible. Julian stood, his expression serene. Good evening, Daniel. I wasn't expecting you. I thought we'd agreed to wait. I thought we'd agreed on a different time. We've delayed the board meeting twice. The governor insisted we wait. He wanted to be here personally, but he got held up by something urgent. He sends his apologies. He sends his regards. I know. I appreciate you giving me tonight. I appreciate the respect. I appreciate the consideration. Daniel nodded. Of course. We weren't going to disrupt your reunion. But they're all here now, and they'd like to meet you. The board members, the foundation heads, the scholarship recipients. They've all been waiting for this moment. They've all been waiting to thank you personally. They've all been waiting to meet you. Only then did Daniel notice the stunned faces around the room. He turned to the reunion host. I believe you're ready. We should proceed. Everyone's waiting. Everyone's ready. The host smiled nervously. We certainly are. Everything is prepared. Everything is ready. Everything is set. Derek frowned, his alpha pheromones spiking with confusion. What exactly is going on? Who are these people? Why are they talking to Julian? Why are they looking at him like that? No one answered him. The host stepped back onto the stage, his voice trembling with excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The room slowly became quiet. Every reunion reminds us where we started. It reminds us of the dreams we once had, the people we once were. But tonight, we'd also like to celebrate someone who never forgot where he came from. Someone who used his success to help others. Someone who gave back when he could have just walked away. Someone who made a difference. Several guests looked around, trying to figure out who the host was talking about. The lights dimmed. A large screen descended behind the stage. This person asked us for complete anonymity. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want praise. He simply wanted to help. He simply wanted to make a difference. He simply wanted to give back. The first image appeared on the screen. A group of children walking into a newly renovated public school. The building gleamed with fresh paint and new windows, a far cry from the crumbling structure it had once been. The children were smiling, their faces full of hope. Their futures had been changed. The next image, a bridge connecting two rural communities. A sleek, modern structure where once there had been nothing but a dangerous river crossing that had claimed lives. Communities that had been isolated were now connected. Another, a modern hospital expansion, state-of-the-art facilities in a town that had never had adequate health care. Doctors and nurses in crisp new uniforms, equipment that had never been available before. Lives that would be saved. Another, scholarship recipients smiling beside their families, clutching diplomas and acceptance letters. Young faces full of promise and ambition. Futures that had been made possible. The audience watched in stunned silence. The final image faded onto the screen, a portrait of Julian Cross. Beneath it appeared the words, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Cross Civic Infrastructure, the largest Omega-owned infrastructure company in the region. Gasps filled the ballroom. Derek blinked, his face going pale. No, that can't be right. That can't be him. That can't be true. Kyle slowly lowered his champagne glass, his elegant facade cracking. That's impossible. He can't be. He's nothing. The host continued. Over the past 9 years, Cross Civic Infrastructure has completed more than 400 public projects, created thousands of jobs, and funded educational programs across the state. His company has transformed communities, built schools, constructed hospitals, and changed lives. He has made a difference. More photographs appeared. Community centers, libraries, roads, schools, clean water systems, affordable housing projects. A comprehensive record of achievement that would make any alpha proud. The audience erupted into applause. Derek stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The host smiled toward Julian. Tonight, we'd also like to publicly thank the anonymous donor whose $40 million gift will build our new Innovation and Scholarship Center. This is the largest donation in our university's history. It will change lives for generations to come. It will make dreams possible. He extended his hand. Mr. Julian Cross, would you please join us on stage? The entire ballroom stood. Everyone except Derek. Everyone except Kyle. Professor Hayes wiped away tears, her hands trembling with emotion. I knew you would change the world. I always knew. I never doubted. I always believed. Marcus smiled proudly, his eyes shining. I've been waiting all night for this. I was hoping. I was so hoping. I was so proud. Julian slowly walked to the stage, his steps measured and calm. He accepted the applause with quiet grace, his expression serene. He leaned toward the microphone. Thank you. The room immediately became silent, everyone straining to hear his words. I didn't come here expecting recognition. I came because this school helped shape the person I became. I came to remember who I was, and how far I've come. I came to honor the people who believed in me. He glanced toward Professor Hayes, especially one teacher who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, who told me that being an Omega didn't mean I had to settle for less, who encouraged me to dream big even when everyone else told me I was being foolish, who gave me the confidence to pursue my ambitions, who made me believe I could be more. Professor Hayes covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. The applause swelled again. Julian continued, Success isn't something we achieve alone. It's something we're trusted to use for others. It's a responsibility, not a reward. And I've tried, every day, to live up to that responsibility. I've tried to build something that matters. I've tried to make a difference. The applause grew even louder. Derek finally found his voice, his words cutting through the celebration like a blade. This is ridiculous. This is insane. People turned toward him, their expressions shifting from celebration to shock. Derek's face was flushed with humiliation, his alpha pheromones spiking with rage and confusion. There has to be some mistake. He can't be. He was never. He was always just. Daniel stepped forward, his expression hard. There's no mistake. I've been Mr. Cross's legal counsel for 7 years. I can personally verify every detail of his success. Every project, every donation, every achievement. Every single one. Derek shook his head, his alpha pheromones spiking with desperation. He said he worked in construction. He said he was a community organizer. He said. Julian smiled gently. I do work in construction, Derek. I build things. I build schools and hospitals and bridges and libraries. I've just built more than you ever imagined. I've just made more of a difference than you ever thought possible. I've just done more than you ever dreamed. Daniel couldn't help smiling. He builds entire cities. He's transformed communities that have been neglected for decades. He's given people opportunities they never thought they'd have. He's changed thousands of lives. A few classmates laughed, not at Julian, but at Derek. His face flushed an ugly red. Kyle whispered desperately, "You never knew? All those years, and you never knew what he'd become? You never even suspected? You never saw the signs?" Derek swallowed hard. "No. I thought. He was always so quiet. I thought he was nothing. I thought he'd never amount to anything. I thought he was a failure." The reunion host spoke again, his voice solemn. "We have one more announcement. Something that will affect all of us. Something we can't ignore." The room settled, curiosity replacing celebration. Our Alumni Association recently initiated a financial review of our scholarship program. An independent audit of all expenditures. A thorough investigation. Derek felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His alpha pheromones spiked with fear. The host continued carefully. "The review is ongoing. We won't speculate about the findings, but all future financial matters will be handled independently, and we have already suspended some spending while the investigation continues. We have already taken action." Marcus looked toward Julian. Julian gave a nearly invisible nod. "No accusations. No public humiliation. Just facts. Just the truth." The ceremony ended with another standing ovation. As people gathered around Julian, Derek pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Julian." Julian turned, his expression calm. "Congratulations," Derek forced out, the words tasting like ash. "Thank you." Derek smiled weakly. "I had no idea. You never told me. You never." "I know," Julian said quietly. "I may have judged you too quickly. I may have made some mistakes. Some assumptions. I may have been wrong about you. I may have been completely wrong." Julian remained quiet, his face unreadable. Derek cleared his throat, desperation creeping into his voice. "My company is expanding. I heard you might be looking for partners. There could be opportunities for us to work together. We could be a powerful combination, you and I. We could change everything. We could dominate the market." Daniel looked at Derek with mild amusement. Julian answered before he could speak. "I'm afraid our procurement process doesn't allow discussions while compliance reviews are underway. I'm sure you understand. I'm sure you understand how these things work." Derek frowned. "What compliance review? What are you talking about?" "The one involving organizations connected to the scholarship fund. The one that started when suspicious invoices were discovered. The one that's currently investigating potential fraud. The one that's looking into everything." His face turned pale. "You think I stole something? You think I didn't say that," Julian interrupted gently. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm saying independent investigators deserve the time to do their work. That's all. Let the truth come out. Let the facts speak for themselves." Derek opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Kyle suddenly grabbed his arm. "We should go. Now. We need to leave. We need to get out of here. But now. Now. Before this gets worse. Before we can't fix this." They hurried toward the exit, their faces flushed with shame. The ballroom buzzed with whispers and speculation. Professor Hayes approached Julian, her eyes shining with pride. "You could have embarrassed him the way he embarrassed you. You could have exposed everything. You could have destroyed him. You could have made him pay." "I could have," Julian agreed. "But you didn't. You chose not to. You chose mercy. You chose grace. There was no reason. He'll be exposed by the truth eventually. That's more powerful than anything I could say. And I don't need to be the one to do it. I don't need to be the one to hurt him." The whole room would have applauded. Everyone would have cheered. Everyone would have loved you for it. Julian smiled softly. "I wasn't trying to win the room. I was trying to be better than him. I was trying to be the person I wished I'd had. I was trying to be the person I needed back then." A few weeks later, the forensic audit was completed. The findings were damning. The investigation uncovered a vast network of shell companies receiving inflated consulting payments from the Alumni Scholarship Fund. Dozens of fake vendors had been created, all of them billing the university for services that were never rendered. Several contracts had been routed through businesses connected to Derek's development firm. Electronic approvals traced back to executives within his organization. Paper trails that had been carefully constructed. Whether every approval had been intentional would be determined in court. But the evidence was enough for city officials to suspend his public contracts while the investigation continued. Kyle quietly resigned from every company he managed, his name appearing in court documents as a co-conspirator. The beautiful facade he'd constructed crumbled overnight. Within days, investors withdrew their support. Banks froze lending. Projects stopped. The empire Derek had so proudly boasted about began to crumble. The buildings he'd talked about so arrogantly were left unfinished. The dreams he'd bragged about were shattered. Meanwhile, investigators publicly confirmed that cross-civic infrastructure had no connection to the missing funds. Every financial review found Julian's company completely compliant, completely above board, completely ethical. His reputation had never been stronger. He was held up as an example of how things should be done. He was praised for his integrity. Months passed. Construction began on the new Innovation and Scholarship Center. Julian traveled to the site regularly, watching the building rise from the ground. Each time he visited, he felt a sense of peace he'd never experienced before. Each time he saw the progress, he felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with ego. It was about what he was building for others. On opening day, hundreds of students gathered outside the beautiful new building. The October sun shone brightly, warming the crowd. A bronze plaque stood near the entrance. It didn't bear Julian's name. Instead, it read, "The Linda Hayes Innovation and Scholarship Center, dedicated to the teacher who inspired generations to dream beyond their circumstances." Professor Hayes stared at the plaque in disbelief, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Julian, you gave me confidence before I had success. You believed in me before I believed in myself. You changed my life. You made me believe I could make a difference." Julian smiled, his own eyes wet with emotion. "You changed mine first. You were the first person who ever told me I could be more. That being an Omega didn't mean I had to settle. That my dreams were worth fighting for. You gave me the courage to keep going when I wanted to give up. You made me who I am." The ribbon was cut. Students poured inside, laughing, talking excitedly about their futures. Their voices echoed through the halls, a chorus of hope and ambition. Marcus stood beside Julian. "You finally got your happy ending." Julian watched the students disappear through the doors. "No," he said softly. "They did. The students did. That's what this was always about. That's why I built all of this. That's why I did all of this." That night, Julian returned to the building alone. The campus was quiet now, the students gone home. He walked through the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. He stopped in front of the plaque and ran his fingers over the engraved letters. He found himself in the scholarship office. The walls were lined with photographs of past recipients, young Omega and Alpha faces, all of them grinning at the camera. All of them someone who'd been given a chance. All of them someone who might have given up without this support. All of them someone who'd been told they couldn't, and had done it anyway. All of them someone who'd been given hope. He didn't hear the door open behind him. "I thought I'd find you here." Julian turned. Marcus stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "They're closing the place down in 10 minutes. I figured you could use one. I figured you might need someone to talk to. I figured you might not want to be alone." Julian accepted the cup. "You figured right. I always need someone to talk to. I always need someone to remind me why this matters." They stood together in silence, looking at the photographs. The faces of the scholarship recipients stared back at them, full of hope and promise. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said finally. "Of course. You can ask me anything. You've earned that right. When Derek was embarrassing you at the reunion, before everything came out, you could have stopped him at any point. You had the truth on your side. You had the power to destroy him. Why didn't you use it? Why did you let him humiliate you? Why did you let him treat you that way?" Julian considered the question carefully. "Because I didn't need to. Revenge is satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't make you better. It doesn't heal the wounds. It just makes you another person who hurt someone. And I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to become him. I didn't want to be like him. And you don't want to be that person." "No." Julian looked up at the photographs again. "I want to be the person who gives other people the chance I didn't have. That's all I've ever wanted, really. A chance. For myself, and for others. For everyone who's ever been told they couldn't. For everyone who's ever been told they weren't enough. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, I always wondered why you never remarried. Or even dated. After everything with Derek. After all these years." Julian smiled ruefully. "I did date. A few times. It was always the same. Alphas who wanted a pretty omega on their arm. Omegas who were so broken they didn't know how to be anything else. I never found anyone who saw me. Just the idea of me. Just the fantasy of what I could be. Just what they wanted me to be. That's because most people are shallow. Most people don't look beneath the surface. Most people don't see who you really are. Most people are scared," Julian corrected gently. "Including me. I was scared of being hurt again. Of trusting someone and having them leave. So I built walls. I focused on work. I told myself I didn't need anyone. I told myself I was better off alone. I told myself love wasn't for me. I told myself I was fine. And now..." Julian was silent for a moment. "Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe needing someone isn't weakness. Maybe it's the bravest thing we can do. The most human thing we can do. Maybe letting someone in is the point of all this. Maybe that's what we're all looking for." Marcus stepped closer. "Julian." He looked up. Marcus's expression was serious in a way he'd never seen before. His scent had shifted, the comfortable beta calm replaced by something sharper. Something almost alpha. Something intense and focused. Something that made Julian's heart race. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said carefully. "And I'm going to ask you to just listen. Don't react. Just listen. Please. I need to say this." Julian nodded, his heart beginning to race. Marcus took a deep breath. "I've known you for 20 years. I watched you get married to Derek, and I watched him destroy you. I watched you break. And I hated him for it. Not because I was your friend, but because..." He trailed off. Julian waited, barely breathing. "Because I was in love with you," Marcus said finally. "I've been in love with you since we were 19, and you helped me pass thermodynamics. Since you stayed up all night with me before the final. Since you didn't laugh at me for being scared of failing. Since you looked at me and saw a person worth believing in. Since you made me feel like I mattered. Since you made me believe I could be more." Julian's breath caught. His hand tightened around his coffee cup. "I never said anything because you were with Derek. And then you weren't. And you were so broken I didn't think I had the right. And then you got strong. So strong. And I thought, he doesn't need me. He doesn't want me. He's building an empire while I'm just here." Marcus looked away, his voice cracking. "But tonight, watching you handle everything, watching you be the bigger person, I realized I've been a coward. I've been hiding behind my friendship for 12 years. Telling myself it was enough. That I was happy being your friend. That I didn't need more. But I do. I need so much more. I need you." "I don't know what to say," Julian whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't have to say anything. I'm not expecting anything. I just needed you to know. Because if I go the rest of my life without telling you the truth, I'll regret it more than I'll ever regret being rejected. I'll regret not taking the chance. I'll regret not telling you." Julian reached out. His hand hovered in the air between them, trembling slightly. "You think I didn't notice?" he asked softly. Marcus blinked. "What? All those years? The way you looked at me. The way you stayed. The way you showed up when Derek left and never asked for anything in return. The way you were always there. The way you never gave up on me." Julian stepped closer. "I noticed, Marcus. I just didn't think I deserved it." "Deserved what?" "Deserved you. Deserved someone who would stay. Deserved someone who would love me for who I am, not who I could be. Deserved someone who wouldn't leave when things got hard. Deserved someone who would see me." Marcus stared at him. "Julian, I wasn't ready. For so long, I wasn't ready. I was too broken. Too scared. I told myself love wasn't for me. That I'd had my chance and I'd ruined it. That I was too much and not enough all at once. That no one could ever really want me. That I was unlovable." Julian's voice cracked. "But you never left. You were always there. And I don't know if I can be what you want. I don't know if I'm capable of being what you need. I don't know if I can let someone in again. I don't know if I can trust again." Marcus took his hand, his fingers warm and steady. I don't need anything from you. I just need you to be you. The same Julian I've always known. The one who stays up all night helping people. The one who builds cities and schools and dreams. The one who never stops believing that things can be better. The one who makes me believe I can be better. The one I've always loved. Julian's eyes were wet now. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone's partner. I've been alone for so long. I've forgotten how to let people in. I've forgotten how to love. Neither do I. But I know I'd rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life wondering. I know I'd rather take a chance than live with regret. I know I'd rather be with you than be safe alone. I know I'd rather have you than be alone. Julian looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked up at Marcus. This man who had been there for 2 decades, who had loved him in silence, who had never asked for anything. This man who had watched him break and helped him rebuild. This man who had never stopped believing in him. This man who had waited patiently for years. This man who had seen him when he couldn't see himself. Okay, he said softly. Let's try. Let's see where this goes. Let's take a chance on each other. Let's see what we can build together. Marcus's face broke into a smile. It was tentative at first, then bright. Really? You mean it? You're not just saying that. Really? I mean it. I've been scared for too long. I've been hiding for too long. It's time to be brave. Marcus pulled him into a hug. It was warm and solid, nothing like the desperate clinging of Julian's younger years. This was comfort. This was safety. This was home. This was everything he'd been missing. This was everything he'd never dared to hope for. I love you, Marcus whispered into his hair. I've loved you for so long. I've loved you for half my life. I've loved you since we were kids. Julian closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. I know. I love you too. I think I've always loved you. I was just too scared to admit it. I was just too broken to see what was in front of me. I was just too afraid to let myself hope. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the quiet building. Outside, the campus lights flickered on, casting soft shadows across the empty courtyard. The Innovation and Scholarship Center gleamed in the distance, a monument to everything Julian had built. And for the first time in 12 years, Julian didn't feel like he was carrying the weight alone. They left the building together, hand in hand. The night air was cold, but Marcus's presence beside him was warm. They walked through the campus in comfortable silence, past the old engineering building where Julian had first realized he wanted to change the world, past the quad where Derek had proposed to him on a spring afternoon, years ago, past all the memories of who he used to be, past all the pain. Do you ever regret it? Marcus asked. Marrying him? Wasting all those years? Giving him so much of yourself? Julian considered the question. I used to. I used to wake up every morning thinking about how stupid I'd been. How I'd wasted years of my life on someone who never really saw me. How I'd given so much of myself to someone who never appreciated it. How I'd let him destroy me. How I'd let him break me. But now I think I needed to go through all of that. I needed to be broken so I could learn how to put myself back together. I needed to lose everything so I could figure out what mattered. I needed to be humiliated so I could find my own strength. I needed to hit rock bottom so I could see how high I could climb. I needed to lose myself to find myself. Marcus squeezed his hand. And what matters? Now that you've figured it out? Now that you've come so far? Now that you've built all of this? Julian stopped walking. He turned to face Marcus, his expression serious. This. You. The students we're helping. The community I've built. Knowing that I'm more than the mistakes I made. That I'm more than what someone else thought of me. That I have something real and lasting. That I have people who believe in me. That I have you. Marcus looked at him with such tenderness that Julian's heart ached. You've always been more, Julian. You just couldn't see it. You were always too busy trying to prove yourself to people who would never appreciate you. You were always too busy trying to earn the love of someone who didn't deserve it. You were always too busy trying to be enough for people who would never be satisfied. Maybe. But I see it now. I see what I have. I see what I've built. I see who I am. I see what matters. I see what's real. They kissed in the middle of the empty campus, soft and sweet. And when they pulled apart, Marcus was smiling. What? Julian asked, his his cheeks flushing. Nothing. I'm just happy. I've never been this happy. I've never felt this complete. I've never felt this whole. Julian laughed. That's not nothing. That's everything. That's all that matters. That's the only thing that matters. They stood together in the silence, watching the stars come out. And for the first time in his life, Julian felt like everything made sense. Not because he'd succeeded. Not because he'd proven anyone wrong. Not because he'd gotten revenge. But because he'd finally stopped trying to prove anything at all. Because he'd finally let himself be loved. Because he'd finally found his way home. He was just himself. And that was enough. That had always been enough. That would always be enough.